To welcome you all to the Center for Justice and Law at Hamline. This is one of our first events that we're actually trying to do hybrid. So thank you for bearing with us as we figure out how to be back in our bodies. It's really exciting to have people in the room. There's bathrooms down the hall. There's water on the table and water fountain here if you need to fill a bottle. I'm Valentine Cadieux, Director of the Center for Justice and Law here at Hamline. And I think that we're a small enough group that I think it might make sense just to do a quick round of introductions so that people know who's in the room. So, as I said, Valentine's she, her. Jennifer, do you want to just start us off?
Hi, my name is Jennifer. I'm a junior, her pronouns, global studies major. This is my second year with the Center for Justice and Law.
Hi, my name is Mary Cohen. I am she, her pronouns. I'm a senior. I study history and also student court.
I'm Olivia Mancia, she, her pronouns, an environmental studies major. This is my first year at the Center for Justice and Law with our environmental justice team.
I'm Hannah Brower. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a senior, double majoring in environmental studies and public health. This is also my first year with the CJL.
I'm Samuel. I'm a junior and I'm majoring. Paul Bogert. I'm an assistant professor in the English department and co-director of the environmental studies program here. Glad to be here.
My name is Danny Baggett, and I'm a sophomore for this major.
I am Michelle Dominguez, I'm a professor in the Hamline School of Education and Immigrant Education.
This is Lizzy Shackelford, research associate, professor, Chicago Council in Global Affairs.
I'm Sonal Gerten, marketing faculty at Hamline School of Business. Lizzy Shackelford, a senior fellow in foreign policy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs.
And thank you so much. So, students, if you want to put up slides while I welcome folks, that would be great. There's a couple of slides we just wanted to use to launch this, so if somebody could flip over to those. I just wanted to give you a little bit of context for this conversation, and then we'll get the conversation started. But we're starting a 2-year sequence on environmental justice in the law here. And we have really been thinking about how are we accountable as a place that is interested in environmental justice from a wide range of fields. We're on indigenous land. We have land acknowledgement that has just been created. We have not really thought through some of the questions of intersections of justice, of the way that being on land, being in public space, being in the epicenter of the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, what does this mean for us? How do we show up and commit to being an environmentally just place? And so we're really grateful that today's conversation panelists are willing to give us a sense of really wildly different spaces in which environmental justice shows up and is important. And can we just look really quickly? Thank you. There's great. So partly because Anansi is joining us remotely, we thought we'd give them the starting place and then create this conversation. You can't see yourself as much, Anansi, but you're next to the others too in kind of a panel format here.
Okay, and we're starting off with a kind of quick 3 to 5 minute overview situations.
Yes, that would be fabulous.
All right, again, so thank you for having me. I'm really interested in thinking about the environment, not just as a type of climatology or climate change or weather, but the ways in which bodies actually interact with the world around them. So one of the things that Valentine began talking about as we started this conversation is the notion of land acknowledgements. And one thing that I found really interesting since moving to the Twin Cities, being in Minneapolis and St. Paul, is thinking about the history, not just of indigenous folks, but Black folks there. So if we wind ourselves to 1829, 1830, 1833, we understand that Dred Scott is first held as an enslaved person here at Fort Snelling over by Minnehaha, right? A place that we now see as both a National Historic Site and a beautiful place to enjoy the land. But what does it mean when we rewind and we understand that in this free region, in this free state, in this free territory, Dred Scott and his family and his later freeborn children are held as enslaved folks on a military base that is entrusted with engaging with freedom and the Union from this standpoint. So even here, in the moment where Minnesota is seen as a kind of free territory, Black people are actually held as enslaved folks on a military base, but also as enslaved people that come with their putative owners on vacation. So Minnesota starts to exist, the Minnesota Territory starts to exist as this space for travel, for vacation, for white folks, and as in some cases as a kind of sovereign space for some indigenous spaces. But for Black people, it's always already a site of witnessing others being able to enjoy the land at the expense of one's own body. We also understand that from Dred Scott being held this moment, we get the Supreme Court case, Dred Scott versus Sanford, right? Which then we get the famous or infamous quote rather from the Chief Justice at the time, Justice Taney, that the white man, the Black man has no rights that the white man is bound to respect. Now, around this same time, George Floyd's grandfather, great-great-grandfather rather, is a person who is enslaved and on the cusp of being free. When they are free, their land is actually stolen from them, and that creates a type of economic dispossession that impacts George Floyd's family in a very interesting way. So years later, after George Floyd's great-grandfather is kind of chased off their land, Floyd's family kind of dissipates and is pushed across the South and then later into the upper Midwest. So I have to ask ourselves, and I ask us all to quickly reflect, what then would happen if George Floyd was actually to inherit the hundreds of acres that his formerly enslaved grandfather owned, as opposed to them being dispossessed from that land and that kind of intergenerational wealth that would have been a different situation than someone being impoverished and dealing with drug addiction and then also being policed and surveilled by kind of trying to enjoy the land in a public space in the same state where we see Black men having no rights that the white man is bound to respect. So I want to push back against this notion of this kind of environmental justice just being about the weather and the kind of climatology, but also about the weather of racism, the weather and the climate of anti-Blackness, and what it means to walk through a space or walk to a nation where stop and frisk in many cases is still the law of the land, where your body, no matter where it's at, going from slavery and the Reconstruction, the backlash to Reconstruction, and vagabond and vagrancy and loitering laws, to understand that Black standing still, Black movement and non-movement, Black walking, Black running, Black immobility are all oftentimes seen as mechanisms for incarcerating, for lacerating, and pushing Black people out of the public commons. So Black relation to the environment becomes something that is really about being surveilled and also about being suspect or suspicious. And that suspicion enabling folks under the peonage system and the convict leasing system to be put back into a situation that is not dissimilar from slavery. In fact, one scholar calls it slavery by another name that then leads us to a type of mass incarceration where folks are in prison working for pennies on the dollar, if that, per day. So then we can also think about this kind of relationship for Black people to the land as also another type of policing. What does it mean that you cannot be in New York City and be bird watching without the police being called on you, right? And this lady then noting in her own notion of power that if I call the police on you, you'll be the one that is disbelieved. Black bird watching becoming some type of criminalization process. Or we can think about Barbecue Becky in Oakland, right? Where this idea that Black people barbecuing in a public space is a type of not only public nuisance, but something that must be put down by law, which is reminiscent of the same things that were happening in Ida B. Wells' book, A Red Record, where Black men and women were being lynched and dismembered for merely trying to engage in the kind of public process of democracy, but also selling their goods in public, also being happy in public, which were kind of seen as one of the first kind of public nuisance laws. So I'll just wrap up with that and pass it on to the other panelists, but I want us to think again about how our enjoyment of the built environment and how that environment itself is kind of co-constructed with white supremacist and anti-Black norms begins to have these kind of afterlives of slavery that continue to affect and animate and emanate from the laws and constitution that guide us today.
Thank you so much for that really generative beginning. I'm just gonna check this slightly so that you're both. Lizzy, would you like to pick up next from there? I'll go back to the.
Sure, happy to. All right, can people hear me? Hopefully people can hear me all right. So I've come up, this is an interesting kind of way to follow on because you're going from the very kind of a very local and very kind of American focus situation to zoom out to big national security engagement and kind of global security as well, because I think, and this ties right into the idea that environmental justice is an issue at every level, writ large, and all the way down to the very local. A lot of what I wrote here, some kind of factoids, are really specifically kind of about climate change, because that's one of the issues that when we talk about national security, thankfully, we finally come around to caring about the climate change impact. But if you think about environmental justice at its most basic point, it's about the fair treatment of everyone and the use, implementation, and enforcement of the environment and how we use the environment and regulate the environment. Globally, the way that environmental injustice has been most pronounced has been the way that the global north and the wealthy countries have been using and exploiting our environment in a way that we've been able to get wealthy off of. And build our societies off of in a way that the global south, kind of as a very large generalization, global south has been paying a much higher cost for our use and abuse of environmental resources, while getting very, very little of the benefit. And so today, and of course, right now, the COP 27 going on right now in Egypt, where this big annual climate conference. One of the biggest debates right now is specifically about this environmental injustice. It's basically, are the wealthy countries going to show up and start paying their fair share, not out of altruism, although that's certainly like, is it fair? It would be fair to pay for this, but out of the fact that there are real global security implications to that environmental justice. So the cold hard truth of national security is that you're not going to persuade national security leaders to take action because it's just unfair. But the fact is that you can tie it back to where it's creating national security conflicts and problems for us. So a couple of things, my points go to a couple of different issues. One is kind of how the top three are kind of how climate change and environmental degradation are harming our own national security. And the last two are more about how our national security tools are kind of exacerbating and further harming climate change and creating greater environmental degradation. Interesting factoid here, that the US military, the Department of Defense, is the single greatest institutional user of an emitter of fossil fuels and emissions. We spend more than $1 billion a year trying to clean up environmental degradation caused by US military facilities, both around the United States. In every single state in this country, we've created environmental degradation and contaminations, and in countries all across the world. And we've largely paid very little cost for that. In many countries around the world, we've kind of just pulled up our tent poles and left. But it's become something that's been much more appreciated recently, the impact that this has on our ability to defend our fundamental national security for a few reasons. They're the direct impacts, the kind of direct risks caused by environmental degradation and this long-term impact of the environmental injustices that we've created, which are, the biggest threat to our actual infrastructure of national security around the world is rising tides, rising waters and storms. It not only costs us a tremendous amount of money every year to try and defend these and defend and rebuild these places. It's a serious risk to our personnel around the world, but it's also a big risk to our military readiness. If a crisis happens and our Navy can't function, you might not think that that's something that's going to happen, but in the next 10, 20 years, it's very possible that we're going to need our military resources to respond, not just to something around the world, but to something that really does directly impact our national security here at home. So those are the direct impacts are the fact that it's becoming harder and harder for us to maintain that readiness. There's also the simple fact that we're planning and building facilities based on old projections. We're building places that are going to be flooded in 5 years. We're spending billions and millions of dollars doing these types of things. So those are the primary ones. But the primary ones for me, I think are a much smaller factor when you're looking at the bigger picture, because yes, that's going to cost us money, but it's a chance that there's going to be something that directly impacts the ability of our military to kind of come to our aid. The secondary risks, however, are tremendous. And those are the risks that come directly from that global north versus global south. We can think that now everybody on Earth needs to come together and address this problem. But the global south has both caused far less of it and is far less well equipped to do so. So why is it in our interest now that we're, at the at COP talking about these issues and talking about who's going to pay, not just for, kind of finding ways to reduce emissions, but how we're going to address that damage that's already been done? Well, there's a real national security case for the United States and other wealthy countries to do so. And that's because environmental degradation and the ongoing impacts of climate change are a tremendous cause of instability and conflict around the world. What it's creating is it's exacerbating competition for increasingly diminishing essential resources. If your community doesn't have water, you will do what you need to do to either get somewhere with water or to fight the people that, for that access to water. It's an oversimplification, but it's an incredible issue, and it's one of those drivers of insurgencies around the world. It's a driver of terrorism around the world. If you zoom out from things like water and you look at issues like deforestation and desertification around the world, all caused by increasingly exacerbated by climate change, and that's driving they estimate 30 million people to become forcibly displaced every year. It's a tremendous amount of people. And it's only going to get worse as parts of the globe become literally uninhabitable. You go out just kind of 1 degree further from simply the lack of access to something like water, the damage to the agricultural industry, both talking about kind of small scale, just feeding local communities, but the agricultural industry writ large. This is a huge industry, and you need to be able to do agriculture to feed people, right? And so when you get to the point where you can't feed people in a large swath of the population, people start moving. They start moving to places where they're going to be able to, feed their families, get water for their cattle, and they're not moving to places that are uninhabited. So, you talk about this on a small scale, let's say between the border of Sudan and South Sudan, or anywhere kind of across that band around where the equator is, where things are getting worse and worse, you get small scale conflicts. You talk about this in a bigger scale where, the Sahara Desert is expanding, where you've got Egypt and Ethiopia fighting over access to the water in the Nile and utilizing the Nile for different purposes. You get to major scale country conflict. And so those are the types of things that, it is in the innate interest of the US government, of European partners, of other large countries around the world like China, to help us find a way to mitigate that impact. And if there is that acknowledgement, once there is that acknowledgement, there's that need for everyone to be in that together. The starting point is to address that environmental injustice that is really at the heart of all of that. So I'll wrap up with that. And
Thank you so much.
Good. A couple of points I wanted to make from a sort of business lens. So I think oftentimes we assume that green marketing and environmental justice are not connected, when in fact they're very much connected. So an output in one lens becomes an input in a different sphere. And so I think it's important to remember that that's very connected. I think secondly, there are many companies that are doing good in this space. Like if you think of Patagonia or IKEA, I think they're leaders when it comes to sustainability. And one of the hopes that I have for brands and companies is that there's so much emphasis on protecting wild spaces and protecting animals, especially from a marketing business vantage point. And I hope that conversation shifts to protecting people as well, right? Because people need protection. And so much of our federally assisted housing is built on hazardous waste sites. And so I hope that this messaging in the business community starts to shift in that direction. The other thing I want to mention is the climate talks that you're talking about. So there's a lot of discussion about Coke and Coca-Cola's involvement and specifically their sponsorship of the climate talks right now. And I would say my perspective on this, I've thought a lot about this, and my perspective on this is I'm very conflicted. So on one hand, Coke is the #1 plastic polluter worldwide. I mean, that's a fact. On the other hand, we cannot solve this climate crisis without the engagement of these big brands companies. Like, they have to be engaged. And so having the tent be bigger and incorporating these companies into these conversations is important, while also recognizing some of the damage that is being done. So that's where I'll stop. I think that there's a couple of other facts on here that are interesting as far as textiles and fast fashion that we can potentially touch on later on.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the strands that go between these. I'm going to just take the slides down. So Anansi, you're big again. There we go. I just feel like, especially the way that you helped us understand some of the anti-Blackness and colonial mindsets underneath the whole governance of space. Then when we think about people moving around, people trying to figure out how do we protect people, there's a lot of through lines here. So we want people who are in the room to feel comfortable also to ask questions. The kinds of questions we are hoping you might be able to discuss is, okay, so we have this situation, which is bad in a number of ways. We have legal frameworks that are supporting this. Where are possibilities that you see in your various areas for change?
I'm happy to start with it, because I'd be curious to hear from both of you about a pathway to, from my perspective, the only way to get the US government and the national security arms of the US government to care about these issues, not just care about these issues, but act on these issues, put resources and money into these issues, is by tying it back to kind of their bottom line, which is national security issues. How do you persuade entities to do the right thing by environmental justice and making sure that they see that it is in their own interest? So is there an element of that? I mean, of course, US government, states governments, they have a commitment to their entire community, so you shouldn't have to tie it to something else. But is there a way that you can draw that thread to making it in the interest of, of the government to do the right thing in these scenarios, and in the interest of corporations to, to reinforce greater environmental justice?
You want to go first and then I can add on?
I see the setup there. No, I mean, I that's something I wrestle with, right? Because, we mentioned in the previous, I think both previous slides about questions of greenwashing, right? And I think that when we think about Black and Indigenous and Latinx communities of color, we have the same issue, right? We think about racial justice and, Nike or Coca-Cola or whoever will put up a person of color as their brand ambassador. Meanwhile, their company is in rural Mississippi polluting a whole community of Black people that's 80% Black. And those folks oftentimes have a lower literacy rate because their tax base, their property tax base is smaller, and therefore the ability to organize or have political power is fully diminished, mostly because of state legislator gerrymandering. So, I mean, part of it is, there's this kind of top line argument where we're like, well, how do we make, environmental justice and racial and environmental justice something that is an imperative to the whole country? I mean, the problem is that if you have people that are considered throwaway people, they're never an imperative. Oftentimes, because when those people are still poor in those communities, they're the first to enlist in the military. They're the most likely to be on the front line, most likely to enlist in the first place, and the least likely to lead and call the shots. So it's a kind of like closed universe here. And so I worry, about how we do this. And I mean, we've seen in the past, in the 60s and 70s, of folks like Fannie Lou Hamer, who created an entire movement that took over the whole state Democratic Party with our own party that was focused on racial justice, environmental justice, and farm and labor justice. So I think there maybe are historical models to look at, but I also think if we lean too heavily on them and we lean too heavily on the kind of capitalistic interests, we actually collapse, right? This whole system that's already ungirded on the backs of certain people further down upon them. So I'm very curious outside of a type of electoral reform, looking at our electoral college, looking at maybe possibly overturning the Supreme Court's decision on political gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering, and hopefully this errant new way of saying that, state legislators are supreme authority on what legislative seats look like doesn't get passed down. But looking at the current court, it's a very, very dire situation in this moment. And there's more things to fear, I think, than solutions.
So as somebody who was born and raised in Mississippi, I share your lack of hope in that direction. But what are you going to do? You gotta.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel that as we have this conversation, it's important to bring up kind of the social media piece of this and how influential that is to this conversation. So I think that one, we as individuals hold a lot more power than in the past, simply because of these channels that never existed before. So I feel like there is hope because we each have so much more power than we think we do. I think secondly, and the research has proven this, that social media is an echo chamber, right? We only are served content that agrees with our perspective. And I think if that's the case, we don't fully understand what other people are going through and why they make the decisions they do. And so I think we have to shift, and I'm guilty of this just as much as everybody else, that instead of a you should do this mentality, it's let's walk with other people. Let's understand their histories and perspectives. And I think we get into this sort of shaming mentality, and I don't think that's productive. I don't think that's healthy. So those are some of the things I would recommend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. Just to follow up, that I do think it's important, to engage with social media. But I think, again, going back to the kind of Mississippi and Fannie Lou Hamer example, one thing that Fannie Lou Hamer did really well was she realized that, the poor white folks around her lacked some of the same opportunities. And the reason they were mad at her as the Black woman for having a loud mouth or being powerful or what have you, is they did not have the political education to understand they were two people at the bottom of the same ship, right? And the kind of racism piece of it was something that obviously impacted Black folks, but it was an abstraction and a distraction for poor white people getting what they needed too. You too cannot read. You too have bad health outcomes. You too cannot get a good education. You too are probably going to be poor like your great-great-grandparents were, right? And so being able to sit back and listen, but also to kind of calmly provide this conversation, I think is something very, very important. But at the same time, I fear that we oftentimes get back into the strange corner where folks are oftentimes most close to the pain or are supposed to suck up their humanity and now be educators or professors or teachers in the community, where in fact, maybe your grandmother just died of, a lung disease because she's living by this plant that other people are cheering on in the community. Right. So I think there has to be a space for the humanity of the folks being most close to this pain and being able to be mad or yell or scream or shame or kick in the moment, but also another infrastructure, to your point, that is allowed and has a way of holding that pain, holding that humanity as a reminder of what all of our humanity looks like, and at the same time opening it up the door, right, and welcoming other folks in. And what I found is too often folks are pressured to wear all the hats in the community. Everybody's not the ambassador. Everyone's not Martha King. Some people are Malcolm X, some people are Fannie Lou Hamer, some people are Langston Hughes, but you need everybody in the room. And that's how you get the work done.
I really appreciate that framing. And I feel like part of what I am hearing in the undertones of this conversation are partly new vocabulary words for many of us who come from a particular disciplinary background. I mean, something I really appreciated about setting this panel up today is really getting to talk with you, Anansi, about the criminalization of people and of being happy in public and thinking about, because I'm a geographer, so I come from a real interest in space. And I realized geography is a discipline that more or less has been invisibilized in the United States. So we don't really have a vocabulary of our relationships in space. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering if all three of you want to talk a little bit about like key words or key questions that we should be listening to. So on social media, on the news, I don't think many of us have made the connection before with national security. And so we don't think of using those arguments. So I just wondered if you each wanted to reflect a little bit of like some of the key things we should be listening for or educating ourselves or, being in more conversation, having more programming around. Like, what do we need to learn to be effectively showing up in these conversations?
happy to start with a small example, which is, I mean, I knew innately, and when we first started talking about this, I knew innately what environmental justice means, but I will admit to having kind of like read a few articles and pieces, because I have never heard anyone say environmental justice in the same sentence as national security. There's a very obvious link. There's a very obvious tie, and it's one that is being discussed extensively by world leaders today. They're doing it in terms of climate change impact. But what it is essentially is, and they're talking about the injustice of it, but they're not talking about it in the environmental justice space. So one thing that I would just encourage people to do, which I did in this example myself, was figure out what the other people you were trying to influence, what words and terminology they use, and find a way to fit in that. Figure out how they talk about the same concepts. And much like, and even I spend a lot of time talking to folks outside of the foreign affairs and national security space about foreign affairs and national security issues. And what you learn to do is how to take out all of that industry language, all of those acronyms and terms that we understand, and break it down. And it's not a natural thing to do necessarily. I would say, some of what we're talking about here, I've got to break down in my head because I have this kind of foreign affairs, national security, US government vocabulary in my head, and that's how I think of things. So take those opportunities, kind of break terms down that you're hearing and figure out what the interest is on the other side and how you can translate in their terms and their language what you're trying to get across, because that's basically what I did with this. But the vocabulary is very important for how you reach people. You go to the Pentagon and start talking about environmental justice, their first thoughts are going to be, a lot of what you were talking about, but not in the national security space. So you just use their language.
A couple of things. When we talk about terminology, I want to touch on greenwashing. So it's a term we use a lot in the business space. And essentially what that means is when you market or promote a product or a brand as green, when their products aren't made sustainable. And so that's what greenwashing is. And so I think just being mindful of, what we can do as individuals is just being mindful of these messages that are being put out there in whatever media, whatever form. Is this authentic? Is it truthful? Is it greenwashing? The other point I'll make is that, a lot of times when we think about environmental conversations, we don't talk about internet pollution. And every like, every tweet, every selfie contributes to internet pollution. And I really want to come back to that point I made earlier, that we all have individual agency in this, right? In shifting the conversation and making change. And when we think about how much time we spend on social media and how much data and how much energy is consumed in all of these transactions, like we can make small changes that can contribute collectively to some pretty big direction.
Yeah, no, and I would tend to agree with Sonal on that too, especially about language. I mean, we can see it in other communities, not just in the business world, oftentimes emanating from the business world. When we think about pinkwashing, right, we can think about ways that there's organizations that will put up a pride flag in June, but also have some of the most horrific rates of discrimination and firing and microaggressions against trans and queer employees, right? Same thing with school districts. Or if we can think about, again, with pinkwashing a little bit further, we understand that the first queer pride was actually a riot against police violence, but now it's a moment for corporations to parade down the cities and show their support in these kind of oftentimes meaningless ways. Or we can think about blackwashing and the kind of DEIification of almost every company in the world now. But oftentimes we see that their rates of diversity, and particularly their rates of real equitable inclusion, have not moved at all. So these are things that are happening, and they're all very intersectional because oftentimes they're the same company. Right. So what does that begin to mean? And I would also say, to Elizabeth's first point, also to kind of think about not just the language of the folks you're trying to communicate with, but I think oftentimes, and I do think that's very successful, but I think it's very important to kind of rupture the kind of linguistic landscape in the first place. I find that when I've, both been in my background in consulting, but also, as a lawyer, what's been really interesting to me is kind of lead back on poetry in the way that poems, and particularly American studies and Black studies, do this really interesting thing where they center the human. Right? It becomes about human emotions and human feelings. And everywhere that I've consulted, it really disrupts this notion of, well, how much money do we make? What are we planning for? When you start talking about so-and-so back home's grandmother dying because of this company and this is what she breathed in. Or when we start talking about Flint, Michigan, we start talking about the effects on this polluted water on unborn and now being born children. Right? We're no longer talking about what is the cost of removing lead pipes. Whoa. Now we're talking about the fact that the whole community, right, is oftentimes dealing with neurological damage of water. Right? What does it mean not to be able to drink water? And so I encourage us to not only become kind of fluent in the language of different industries, but to also become fluent in the language of the human body and of human relation, because when we get into these acronyms and we get into the kind of specialties, we get further and further away of the beauty of a life that was lost, or the beautiful life that never got to be born. So I encourage us to really kind of lean into those things as well. And I would say the other piece about which has been interesting with law is kind of really going back and comparing to where we're at in the side of environmental justice moment globally, to Elizabeth's point, but also where we've been with Black history and indigenous history historically. So right now, at the G20 and earlier this week, folks have been talking about, what are essentially reparations, right, for lower income countries in the global South. But when we've talked about that same type of thing, whether it's reparations for slavery or Jim Crow, what have you, United States, it's quickly shut down as impossible. But part of those reparations for Jim Crow and slavery are also about environmental justice. Where do Black people live now in the South? There's a whole place in the country that we call Cancer Alley. Right? And it's mostly where Black people live, by these type of corporations, where they're also paid low wages, right? So it's interesting where some things work and some things differ. And again, just kind of wrapping up, not to take up too much time, but when I was talking earlier about the policing issue, we can, if we return and we think about, how far we moved from slavery and how are the law or how is the language similar, the furtive gesture in policing is this kind of thing where an officer can essentially say they made a furtive gesture, I feared for my life, and you have justifiable reason to kill them. Right, or to shoot them or to do whatever it is in that moment. And the word furtive in legal parlance means the movement without leave. It actually comes from pre-colonial and then gets reinstantiated in the United States in the 1700s to talk about slaves that are moving without permission. Right. So when we trace the language and we trace the etymology, now we can begin to think about how is this about a body that is moving without someone else's leave, someone else's permission? And why does the movement of that body elicit fear? And why does that fear, no matter how rational it is, result in a justifiable homicide? It's stunning when we think about it. And we can think about the same things when we think about environmental justice, to the ways in which we can think about the forced removal of Native Americans across the country. Right? And disregarding of their relationship to the land, because those that were in power thought their claim on the land was more important than these traditions and these life-saving ceremonies and ways in which indigenous people interact with the earth around them, and they sustain the earth and the earth sustained them. So these are not new stories. So I think it's really important for us to kind of really sit with our history and be mindful of who the writers of those history are to kind of get to where we need to go in the future and not make those same mistakes.
Yeah, just to add on to that point, Anansi, I think when we think about all these environmental organizations that have done a lot of good, they have racist histories when you think about their founders. And I think acknowledging that, right, and saying, we still have a long way to go. Like if you think about Audubon Society, if you think about the Sierra Club and John Muir, very, very racist histories. And so I think it's very important at that point to acknowledge the human element and acknowledge the histories of people about environmental justice.
Just going to put in a plug. History, study history.
Yes.
There's a history major. I think it's incredibly important. There's a lot written now on the foundation of American policing, which that was just a good introduction to. But you understand so much more about where our problems come from today and the ways that you can address them without just kind of papering things over if you understand where things started. Sure.
I just wanted to jump in with thanks, because I feel like in response to that question, yeah, to be on the screen there, one of the things that made me really think about was, so I've been working a lot on urban agriculture as a space that really does rupture that linguistic landscape. And one of the pieces we've been working on in the glossary is about rank vegetation, because this idea that we can control everything. And so I think sometimes one of the concepts I really appreciate from, it's the more dry version of the beauty of centering the human, but is in the planning literature, people talk about containment and counter-containment of narratives particularly. And there's so much in the way that racist history of space control is about containment. And when we can think about centering the beauty of human experience in a much more radical and a way that perceives difference without that need to control and allow, to center that, then it asks for a counter containment that maybe is easier for people if we start with plants and protecting animals, and to say, all right, we have all this, we've all agreed this is a good idea. How do we apply this to the humans? So curious is, where do you see this being done well? I know there are some, like, I don't want to have a false hope. I recognize that the concerns about hope you've all raised are really legitimate and real. And also there are people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who so brilliantly reached across color lines and said, like, yes, we can do this thing together. So I'm curious, in the spaces that you have been referring to, if there are other people we should be reading the history of or listening to on social media, like, who are some of the people that we need to learn from in this space? And I'm going to actually add another question to this while you think about it, which is, are there, from your own areas, are there analytical frameworks that are useful for thinking about this? Like, for example, I'm just going to use the rank vegetation. Nobody really knew what rank vegetation meant. It's sort of like furtive movement. And when we step back and we can say, all right, here's a little bit of a framework about why that is being spoken of in that way. Like, here's what it meant to control people's sources of nutrition so that they had to be part of the labor market. Like that, then I think it frames for people a little bit like why we should pay attention to this, and maybe why it's worth, like, reparations, I think, are another good example. I had no idea of the way that conservative culture was talking about reparations as a particular kind of fiscal impossibility until I was introduced to this by students. And then I could say, oh, well, here's all the ways in which that could be rethought, and here's what's at stake. So I think, yeah, just who you might want us to be listening to, and what are some of the ways that your various areas of expertise help us use vocabulary of why this is useful for people to pay attention to, or how?
Now, little known fact, W.E.B. Du Bois was both a major player in African-American history and political movements, also a brilliant foreign affairs writer and
Yes.
and if you can read some of what he's written and some of what has been written about him recently, there's been the kind of a revival of looking into some of his foreign policy work. But long before anybody else was addressing some of the questions of the great, the impact of the great injustices, which speak to environmental injustice as well, but also just the injustice of the exploitation between the global north and the global south. So he's written some amazing things. He was probably the first African-American or even African of any background scholar on foreign policy, and wrote for one of the magazines that, Foreign Affairs, that began also as a very racist magazine in its early time. So a really fascinating scholar to look to for that intersection of, these issues of race and justice and exploitation in the foreign policy world.
Yeah, and I would also say, looking at their work, particularly Black Reconstruction, and their work on the United States' relationship with Haiti, and then even before them, I mean, we can look at Frederick Douglass doing some of this type of work as well. But to Elizabeth's point, like this is not a new conversation. And Du Bois is kind of also noted as the father of sociology and the creator of American studies. So if you're in school right now, I mean, these are some of the foundational texts you can read. And again, to co-sign Elizabeth, I would like to say, I mean, again, history, and not just a history of, maybe that your professors are giving you, or, someone's accounting of a time, but go back and read the narratives of the enslaved. Go back and read the text from the Freedmen's Bureau. Go back and read what indigenous people are writing about their experiences, both at the onset of type of colonization, but also after the kind of Trail of Tears. What are their relationships to the land? And then think about how those things have changed or not changed, right? Because sometimes the best historical texts are those by people just witnessing their own lives, that are unadulterated by folks in power, folks that don't want to deal with political things. So I would say that now, I guess, to kind of think about people that are having these conversations right now, maybe it's a shameless plug, one of my mentors, and I think one of the greatest probably writers of our time, is Imani Perry. In her last book, New York Times bestseller, South to America, talks about not just people's relationship to land, but the nation's first and kind of second founding, and how that's ordered and disordered the ways in which particularly Black and other people of color live and die in the United States. And it's a type of text that is just really easy to digest, but really heavy with both like kind of personal narrative, but also deep historical archival work.
I would suggest that in terms of who we listen to, I challenge for us to listen to ourselves and challenge our own habits and perspectives. I know I've mentioned that a few times. I mean, I think everything is connected, right? Everything that we do is connected to environmental justice. So, for example, I mean, this is just one small thing. It's why do we follow certain influencers on social media, like Kylie Jenner, right, who has 200 million followers and 1,000 pairs of shoes, right? Like, there's such a disconnect there. And so I think just be really mindful of the messages that we are consuming in these spaces and the people that we're following. And there's so many, actually, there's some good tools on the internet where you can sort of assess your own environmental impact, your own carbon footprint. And I suggest kind of once a year, once every few months, kind of tracking that. What am I doing? What is my part in this story? And how can this change? How can my part in this story change? The other piece I'll mention is I do think that it's interesting to learn about the story of Patagonia and what they've done in the community. I mean, obviously they've been in the news because the founder, it's essentially a $3 billion organization that is now owned by the Earth, essentially a nonprofit and a trust. So I think that they're a good organization to learn from. I think that there's more work to be done to include kind of the human element, protecting humans, as we've talked about. But I do think that's a good start.
I'll just note that perpetual trust model is being picked up in Minnesota. And these are a couple of threads I would really love if anyone hears more about them. One is to try to make it more possible for people to collectively own land, and potentially for land, especially free producing or natural land, to own itself. And there's a seed from international diplomacy that I have heard of and have not heard much more of where this came from, but that in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where there's a river and what used to be a national park that now own themselves, they have legal entityhood, that was an idea that came out of conversation with indigenous folks in Minnesota. So that there are seeds of that potential within the culture of land stewardship, which is a long history that has been disrupted for only a short period of time. So I think sometimes that's part of that capturing and counter framing discursive landscapes, is to say what we think of as normal is really new, and maybe it was a bad idea that needed to be rethought.
Yeah, just to comment on that, Valentine. One thing that's interesting with that too is it's on the transnational space is in 2019, it was the 400th year anniversary of the advent of American chattel slavery. And of the 400 year of return, Ghana, the nation of Ghana opened up this kind of relationship and this call to African Americans to have not only dual citizenship, but also to come and co-own and nurture and take care of the land in Ghana. And at least from as far as I know, thousands of people have actually taken part of that. And it's this idea of like, how do you revitalize Ghana where the majority of, African Americans were stolen from? So that's another model that's happening. We're seeing it happen across Western Africa in a very, very kind of enduring way as well.
Thank you for bringing that up, because I think that's something that I know there are a lot of people here in Minnesota who participate in that, and that's something it would be great to be in conversation with. And I just going to put a plug in that this is one of the things that this conversation hopefully leads to many more, and especially with the Mitchell Hamline Center that Anansi is directing now. This is the kind of thing we'd love to dig into more. So thanks for bringing that up. Well, we have a couple more minutes. I do want.
Thank you to everybody here. Coming from the English department, I'm excited to hear all the emphasis on language, of course, and I think story is so important as well. And I'm interested in a couple of things. Anansi, I wonder if you know the Heather McGee's book, The Sum of Us, and if you've been, if that speaks to you. And then Elizabeth, I wonder if you think the shifting of our use of language around climate and the military is provides some realistic possibilities for drawing in the right a little bit more. Like if if you're not going to quote unquote believe in climate change, but you still believe in national defense, maybe we should act a little bit differently. So a couple kind of different questions, but love to hear from what's about that.
Yeah, I would just say very quickly, it's a great book. I'm actually teaching a 6-month-long seminar for the Twin Cities diversity and inclusion practice lawyers on that book and a related book starting actually this Friday. So I'll be in town for that.
The national security question, absolutely. It has been a sea change to see the Pentagon starting to acknowledge what a huge issue this is, and that it's not something that you can ignore or pretend isn't happening. And that has been key to getting, folks in Congress, kind of other players on the kind of side of the aisle that is typically less concerned about environmental issues and less aware of or accepting of climate change as an issue. I mean, quite frankly, the US military is a very trusted institution. And when you have, 5-star generals telling Congress that this is a major national security crisis, that's the kind of thing that gets them to pay attention. It comes back to kind of what I was originally saying, like, you have to find a way to make the other people who have influence on this care about this issue because of their own selfish reasons. And that has been a real way to be able to get this higher on, on the priority list for, because in the US government, you got to have people on both sides of the aisle care about it, or your ability to sustain a long-term focus on it is non-existent.
So what I'm just about to ask comes from a colleague of mine from St. Thomas, Dr. Muffet Trout. And she's in social studies education, and her work is largely centered around why is the environment science's problem? So why do we rely on science for innovation to fix the issues with the environment? She comes from social studies. So her work looks at the difference between ecocentrism and anthropocentrism. So these are two different ways that humans, through what you might call religion or wisdom traditions, consider the world, right? So ecocentrism is land-based faith traditions. So I live in this place, I care for this land is my spirituality, right? Anthropocentrism is human-based wisdom traditions. So Christianity would be an example of anthropocentrism. And you can drop it in anywhere, right? So you can show up somewhere where there is a land-based wisdom tradition, plop down Christianity, which is a human-based wisdom tradition. And from Muffet Trout's perspective, which I think is really interesting, now we are no longer caring for the land. The other element that a religion like Christianity has is this belief in Armageddon, like the world's going to end anyways, right? So since the world is going to end, it's not really my problem. Like, let's just go down with it and pray, right? So this idea that I'm going to say has come from her has rattled me and has made me really think about the spread of Christianity potentially being the demise of the planet, or the spread of an anthropocentric religion, right, or wisdom tradition being the demise of the planet. And I know this is a controversial thing to even bring up, but I'd love to hear from the three of you. What do you think about that idea?
Scary and possibly true. Because there's so much in Christianity that basically says, you know, that the problems on earth are caused by people's sins and that, you know, et cetera, and we have so much control over it. But getting back to your initial point of, you know, why is climate considered science problem? I mean, I think that gets to that whole kind of personal responsibility element that you were talking to as well, which is there is a need for science to address how we manage and how we reduce some of this, but it's also not rocket science. We know how to address these things. And a lot more of it is stuff that needs to be handled by regulation, by governance, and by communities. And so, you know, I think that that's a really good point that, like, at a point where you know where you've got the tools and you know how to do it, how to address that problem. It's all about political will, social will, and, you know, individual action. I think a little bit of, we can all do the best we can, and unless many others of us do it, you need some form of kind of systemic change. And that comes to like that question of responsibility. So yeah, yes, recycle, don't buy fast fashion, reduce all of your use, but also, you know, work on these kind of systemic changes that can do it. And I think that acceptance of personal responsibility over it, and that, you know, thoughts and prayers, etc., won't address all of these problems, is really essential. I fear that our government is getting more and more influence from, you know, nothing against religion, but getting more and more governance influence from particular religious backgrounds that see problems as not being caused by the things that they like in their lives. We have that excuse. And I think that's at the heart of it, one of the problems with having a heavily religiously influenced government, because there's so much in there that is kind of hierarchical, and some people cause their own problems, and we're going to heaven, it's fine. So I think that's a really interesting point. And I see some of those concerns with kind of a growing religious influence in particular parts of our religions.
I would also say yes, and I think traditionally the environment has been viewed, to your point, as something to be conquered, right? Whether it's people, whether it's land, you think of the gold rush, everything, something to be conquered. And I do see that there's some shift away from that, particularly in Western societies. So I don't know about Christianity in particular, but overall, from a value system standpoint, I do think there is some positive shift away from this sort of conquering mentality.
You know, I guess I'll say this as, you know, the person that was ordained at 14. I think particularly Western religions, but most large scale religions, maybe outside of Buddhism, have a really big problem with admitting their complicity with large scale violence, particularly violence or obstructions or destruction rather, that cannot be explained just by one person's actions, and there isn't someone that can be damned to hell, and then we can all move on about our lives. And I would also say, for the most part, the larger religions have been on the wrong side of history for most major calamities. We can think about, you know, what has happened with people of almost all races through space and time, right? We can think about women and, you know, Salem witch trials and slavery and the Holocaust and all these things, and on and on and on. And even today, right, there's yet to be a full mea culpa or accounting for those effects. So I would say that nothing is more terrifying to me than the kind of religious rejection of the Anthropocene. And that's very, very, you know, terrifying, because the belief is, to Elizabeth's point, that, you know, if you know, we all live right, God will save us and we'll be fine. Or we'll go back, you know, to the Old Testament and talk about, you know, how the world was flooded before and this time it'll be by fire. I don't know about everybody else, but I'd rather not be here if the world is going to be in a mass climate disaster that is a flood. I don't want to be on a giant ship. And I also don't want to be here when the California wildfires take over the whole nation. So I do find a deep and very serious concern with some of the anti-science approaches of some religions, but I also do want to give credit to the indigenous religious spiritual practices, and also those of other people of color that are tied to the land and the kind of connection between land and humans.
Thank you. This is a wonderful place for us to park. Thank you all so much for showing that the midday lunchtime is possible for people, and I really look forward to continuing these conversations. So please help me thank our speakers today. It was wonderful to be in conversation with you.
Thank you all.
We'll look forward to seeing you when you're in town, and please, everyone, feel free to take lots of lunch. So,
All right, y'all take care.